Everyday injustice. Too many wrongful convictions. Corruption has infected the criminal justice system, leaving too many people helpless, fighting for their lives. Instead of receiving justice, people suffer. Is that why they say justice is blind?
Today on Everyday Injustice, we are talking with Shanna Rifkin from FAMM, FAMM. And what is FAMM?
So thanks for having me, David. FAMM is formerly Families Against Mandatory Minimums, but FAMM is a criminal justice organization that works to reform the system at both the federal and state level. We do much more than mandatory minimum work, although that was how we started, and we still do a lot of work around advocating against mandatory minimums. But it's really a much broader, our organization has a much broader scope now and works to address all kinds of injustices for people who are sentenced in prison.
And so we've been following the story out of Dublin in California for a while now. And it's a pretty crazy story, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's true. What's crazy about the Dublin story is that it's actually not that crazy. Because the Dublin story that you're referring to is a story about sexual abuse in prison, and sexual abuse in prison is not uncommon. But what is uncommon is the attention that is being paid to what happened at FCI Dublin, which is a federal correctional institute that's now closed, but was in Northern California. And again, one of the things that's really unique is that typically people don't really pay attention to stories of sexual abuse in prison, because I think there's this, you hear the cultural phenomenon about for men, don't drop the soap or things like that. And, it's sort of almost passed off as a joke, and it's anything but. And sexual abuse in custody is a huge abuse of power. It is a pernicious problem that I think is finally getting its due. So Dublin is really the canary in the coal mine that has helped open up people's hearts and minds to the injustices of sexual abuse in custody.
So why has Dublin kind of taken on this significance? What was unusual that caused this to, first of all, it got attention, and second of all, it led to the closure of the facility, which I think is pretty unusual.
Yeah. So maybe it will help to give a little bit of history to what happened at FCI Dublin. So Dublin, the most recent kind of issues with sexual abuse came to light a few years ago when the AP, the Associated Press, ran a story about sexual abuse at Dublin, and described the sexual abuse as so rampant that Dublin was known colloquially as the Federal Rape Club, which I think just underscores how significant the abuse was at that institution. And I think what was unique about Dublin was that Dublin's located in Northern California. There are a lot of progressive, interested advocacy organizations and communities in Northern California, as well as local reporters who are really interested in and gave, validation to the stories of incarcerated people. So the AP story came out, and then local reporters, one reporter in particular, Lisa Fernandez at KTVU, she's in a Fox local channel in Northern California. She started covering the story in an incredibly zealous and in-depth way. And advocates started rallying to support the people who were being abused at FCI Dublin. FCI Dublin is a women's institution. I should have said that at the beginning. It's a women's institution, or was. And as the abuses came to light, so did the prosecutions of the guards. It's pretty rare to have federal prosecutors not only investigate BOP guards, but take the step of indicting them in federal court and then bringing criminal charges against guards. And I think one of the things at Dublin that was so striking was that we're not talking about sort of kind of lower level guards, we were talking about the warden at FCI Dublin, the chaplain, as well as many other guards. And so, you know, when you're talking about a culture, an institution, right, this was top down. The abuse was happening at all levels, from the warden to the chaplain to other guards who are overseeing the daily lives of women who are in their custody. And I think that's part of what made this story so deeply disturbing and had so much traction with people, because the level of corruption, the level of abuse was so deep. And many of the people who were in custody felt so hopeless, and like, you know, they would never, like, their voices would never be heard. And I suppose a silver lining of what happened at Dublin was that their voices were heard. You asked about the closure. So this was, the AP story came about 2 years ago. And in the past 2 years, there have been a number of guards prosecuted from Dublin. At the same time, there have been a number of women who have applied for a reduction in sentence, which is essentially a motion to try and have their original sentence reduced because of extraordinary and compelling circumstances. And then at the same time, there was a civil class action lawsuit that was filed against the Bureau of Prisons for all of these things that were going on at FCI Dublin. The sexual abuse, but also medical neglect, you know, a whole host of alleged constitutional violations. And then early this spring, the judge who oversees the civil class action suit took a pretty extraordinary step and imposed a special master over FCI Dublin. And that has never happened in BOP history. And shortly thereafter, out of nowhere on April 15th, or seemingly out of nowhere on April 15th, we all, as in advocates and community members, got notice that FCI Dublin was closing. The timing was pretty fishy, because this closure came on the heels of the special master. BOP has responded publicly and in court filings saying that they had been planning this closure for quite some time. Who knows what really happened, but the closure itself was subject to a lot of scrutiny from advocates, as well as members of Congress, senators, and congressional officials
And it was
were upset with
believed,
this.
sorry to interrupt there,
No.
but it was believed by some, at least, that the closure was a way to avoid some of these lawsuits and other things.
Yeah, that has been alleged in some court filings. I'm not involved in the civil case, so I can't, you know, comment as specifically about what has been going on in the civil case, but that's what was alleged, was that the closing was in response to having the special master imposed. And ostensibly, I think their argument was that the special master was on the cusp of having access to a lot of internal documents and files about what was going on at FCI Dublin. And so the closure was a way to avoid some of that scrutiny, because BOP could just, you know, close the prison, shut down the special master's access, and then transfer all of the nearly 700 women in custody to different women's facilities across the country. The issue for BOP was that the judge had written her class action order, I believe, in a way that she could still retain jurisdiction over all of the individual class members, even when they had been transferred across the country. So there still is some oversight that the court is able to have over the people who were transferred from Dublin to other institutions. But obviously, you know, practically speaking, it's gotten a lot more difficult because, you know, whereas before you had everyone in one place where you could easily lawyers could easily communicate with them, advocates could visit them. They were all, you know, in the same kind of general location as the court. And now the people who were incarcerated at FCI Dublin are spread across the country. So that dispersion has, I think, made it a lot more difficult for the civil attorneys, as well as, frankly, for us criminal defense attorneys who are trying to help with reduction in sentence motions.
And I'll get to that in a moment. but I did want to close the circle here. So you had mentioned that one of the unusual things about Dublin is that a lot of the people involved were upper level people. And, from my perspective, one of the things that caught my attention was that the warden, the former warden, actually, was prosecuted, which seems also pretty unusual.
Hmm. Yeah, the warden. And so, as I said, I think that was what piqued people's interest in this story at the beginning. Was the warden was one of the first people to be prosecuted in these Dublin cases. Um, and not only was he the warden, but he was also the PREA auditor. PREA is the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And so when people ask, well, why, wasn't there a check on what was going on? Well, the warden was supposed to be the check, and he himself was convicted of sexually abusing people in his custody. So that's part of why there was no check. And that, I think gets us to this other issue that FAMM has been deeply involved in, which is independent oversight of our federal prisons. And there was a bill that was passed in Congress a few weeks ago in the House of Representatives, and we're waiting. Hopefully it will pass through the Senate and the president will sign it. And then that will help with situations like this, where there is corruption within the institution, even at the highest levels. Having independent oversight and independent ombudsman can assist with this type of, deep level corruption and abuse of power.
And it seems to me, and this gets back to kind of your initial point, is that this really isn't unusual. It's just the way this thing has unfolded is unusual. And this seems like it should be the tip of the iceberg, right? Like if this is happening at Dublin, it's probably happening in a lot of places.
Yeah, that's right. So John Ossoff, Senator Ossoff from Georgia, had a really great report that he put out, I want to say it was a year and a half ago now, through his subcommittee in the Senate. And his report found that in the institutions that house federal correction institutions that house women, in 2/3 of those institutions, women had been abused by guards. So clearly, this is not a problem that's isolated to Dublin. That's why when I talk about Dublin, I always say it's the canary in the coal mine. I represented a client who was released a few weeks ago, and she was abused by a guard at FCI Tallahassee in Tallahassee, Florida. There were guards prosecuted at FCI Aliceville. There were prosecutions of guards across the country. And then, the other kind of obvious issue, we were just talking about closing the prison. Closing a prison, it wasn't the walls, the actual building at FCI Dublin that was raping and sexually abusing the women in custody. It was the people who were paid to protect them. And that really gets us to this issue of culture, of oversight, of changing the way that people who are supposed to be protecting the incarcerated population view those people. I would hope that guards would view incarcerated people as human beings and would treat them with respect, but clearly that's where the work is. That's the work that I think BOP needs to do in looking at what has gone on at Dublin and other institutions.
Yeah, I mean, that's a key point, because if you look at the literature on sexual assaults in prisons, I mean, the percentage of women that are sexually assaulted is just astronomical.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's not like this just snuck up on us, right? Like
Right.
we've known this for a long time. And unlike in the men's prison, the culprits are generally the staff. And so the people that are supposed to be protecting people are the culprits, which seems to me pretty problematic.
Yeah, it's deeply problematic. I also want to say that there's nothing, that suggests, I haven't seen enough research to know, but I don't think that this problem is limited to female institutions. I think that, I'm sure that there are guards in male institutions who are sexually abusing men in their custody as well. I think that it's incredibly hard to come forward as a woman in custody about the sexual abuse that has occurred. I think it's probably even harder to come forward as a man in custody about being abused by a guard, just for, gender reasons, cultural reasons. But hopefully, what this is doing, what all of this Dublin work is doing, is cracking open this issue and making it more, as a society, making us, forcing us to really listen to these stories and reckon with them and give people, give these survivors their due. And I think that's what, that's a little bit what we have seen with the way that some of these sentencing reduction cases have been handled, and the civil class action case as well.
And then there's another layer to this. So they close down the prison, and then they transfer these women out of the prison, and that turns into a nightmare scenario.
Yeah. And so the transfer itself was an incredibly chaotic, trauma-inducing, re-traumatizing situation for a number of reasons, right? So FCI Dublin was the only low camp on the West Coast. And so people who were in custody there, many of them had family members who could drive to see them. They had their lawyers who were close by, advocates. They had reporters and journalists who were used to going to see them and communicating with them. And they were essentially ripped away from that community, transferred across the country, and put in places that were foreign and unfamiliar, far away from their families, lawyers, and advocates. The transfer process itself was incredibly confusing. Family members were reaching out to us, not knowing where their loved ones were concerned about the health and safety. We've heard stories about medication that was withheld during the transfer, both mental health medication as well as medications like blood pressure pills, things that people need to have access to. And what's really frustrating is that, all along, BOP has said that this transfer, there was a plan in place, that they had been planning this for quite some time, and they were committed to an orderly, peaceful transfer. But all of the stories that we hear from people who were actually transferred fly in the face of BOP's, alleged plan for this transfer. They have people who have years remaining on their sentence who are in pretrial detention centers, which is no place for anyone who is designated. Pretrial detention centers, many of them, you're not able to go outside. You don't have video visits with your family. They don't have the same kind of programming. There was one story that Lisa Fernandez reported on where on a bus, as part of the transfer, one of the bus drivers played the Wheels on the Bus song at full volume on repeat over and over, which, that really kind of, it's deeply disturbing to think about that. Music has been used like that as a tool of torture and other situations, and I think that was just a really gross situation. Many of these people are survivors of abuse, and so they were being transferred because BOP couldn't keep them safe at Dublin. And then they were subjected to all of these kinds of trauma and chaos as part of this transfer. It was a really horrible situation. And we've heard from many people who are now in other facilities that they continue to be retaliated against. They feel like they have a target on their back. It's hard for them to assimilate in their new setting. So the problem's not going anywhere.
Yeah, I remember reading that story on the Wheels on the Bus, and I cringed. It's enough when your kids are singing it in the back of the car hours.
Right. I know.
Let alone having somebody trying to torture you. So part of what you're doing personally is trying to get people released on compassionate release. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so compassionate release is also known as a reduction in sentence. compassionate release or reduction in sentence is one tool that we have in the federal system to change someone's criminal sentence in extraordinary and compelling circumstances. So in the federal system, when you are sentenced to a crime, that sentence, whatever it is final. Unlike state systems, there's no parole for most people in the federal system. So if you're sentenced to 15 years, you are serving 15 years. But the exception to that is if you meet the standards in the reduction in sentence statute. And again, that's if you have an extraordinary and compelling circumstance for release. And you also have to meet what are known as the 3553A factors, which are present at every federal sentencing or resentencing. And so around 2022, when the AP story came out about Dublin, we at FAMM have been working on compassionate release cases for quite some time for medical, for individuals who are sick and dying in prison, for individuals who have serious family circumstances, for individuals who have unusually long sentences. Those have all been deemed, extraordinary and compelling circumstances. And when we read these stories that were coming out of FCI Dublin, we thought to ourselves, well, what's more extraordinary and compelling than being sexually abused in custody? When a judge sentences you to prison, they're not sentencing you to be sexually abused by BOP guards. And so we organized a group of lawyers and worked with partners in Northern California who are involved in this civil suit to create a clearinghouse, so to speak, where we get intake requests from individuals who are in custody, who have been sexually abused. We review their cases and try, for certain cases, try to find pro bono lawyers who can bring their case to court. And we help with, sort of the strategy, we help with resources, we help think through all of these kind of tough issues in these cases. And we brought, one of the lawyers who works with us brought the first compassionate release case from the Dublin group, arguing that it was, what the circumstances at Dublin were extraordinary and compelling, and that her client should be released from prison early because of what she had experienced. And in that case, the federal prosecutor did not oppose it. And the judge granted the motion, and the client was released to time served, which meant that she was effectively released to the amount of time that she had already served in prison. And that was a really extraordinary circumstance. It was quite incredible to see that first case, and each case that has come since has been incredible to see, because we're really, what we're doing is we're convincing judges, we're convincing prosecutors, and we're convincing the general public that sexual abuse in custody changes the nature of a prison sentence, and it makes the prison sentence so patently unjust that no one should have to serve more time, because that the nature of that sentence becomes so onerous when someone has been subjected to sexual abuse by people who are paid to protect them. So we took this first tranche of cases and brought it to the United States Sentencing Commission. The United States Sentencing Commission is a federal agency that creates the United States sentencing guidelines, which every single federal judge uses in sentencing proceedings. And the Sentencing Commission is tasked with defining what are these extraordinary and compelling circumstances. And so with this first tranche of cases, we told the Sentencing Commission, when you define extraordinary and compelling circumstances, you ought to include sexual abuse in those circumstances, because there is nothing more extraordinary and compelling than being sexually abused. And it was an interesting process because the Department of Justice responded and said, yes, in certain circumstances, and I'm paraphrasing, we agree that sexual abuse in custody is a legitimate ground for a reduction in sentence motion, but we have some concerns. And the Department of Justice asked the Sentencing Commission to essentially include an evidentiary standard in this, sexual abuse definition. And the Sentencing Commission adopted that evidentiary standard. And what that evidentiary standard says is that in order to be a victim of abuse for the purposes of compassionate release, you have to prove that there was sexual, there was sexual abuse as defined by statute, which requires penetrative genital contact, or and then in addition, you have to prove that the guard was either prosecuted in a criminal case, was convicted in a criminal case, was found liable in a civil case, or found liable in an administrative case. And that's really problematic for a number of reasons.
Seems like a very high threshold.
It's a very high threshold. There are a number of other grounds for compassionate release. None of the other grounds require an extra evidentiary hurdle. We only ask that of victims of abuse. So that, I think, is wrong, just generally speaking. But you're right that it's a high bar. Many of the people who were abused at Dublin were, there was kind of gross stalking. There were guards who would stand outside their cells and say, "We won't let you use the shower unless you flash us or take off your clothes." To me, that's equally pernicious. That is equally an abuse of power. And then there's a huge problem with requiring criminal convictions or civil liability or administrative liability. So the biggest problem is that who directs the course of a criminal case? It's the Department of Justice, right? So the Department of Justice essentially now has control over not just the criminal case for the guard, but also the compassionate release case for the survivor. And that is directly in tension with the First Step Act of 2018, which allowed it removed the Department of Justice and the Bureau of Prisons from the driver's seat of these compassionate release cases, because before only the Bureau of Prisons could bring these cases. And it said, no, we want incarcerated people. Congress said, we want incarcerated people to be able to bring these cases themselves without the chokehold of the BOP. Now, by requiring a criminal conviction of a guard, the Sentencing Commission has essentially put the Department of Justice back in the driver's seat for many of these cases. And that's something that we're deeply concerned about.
So we're almost out of time, but I did want to ask one more question. Looks like, at least as of a few weeks ago, you'd taken on 25 of these cases. What was the criteria? And also, I guess, do we have a sense of how many victims we have in this process?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't have a total sense of the victims. I mean, after the closure, I now have 95 cases that I have to review for intake. So, I mean, that's a huge upswell. We, have more cases that we are taking on as we speak. The criteria that we look for is pretty I mean, we have a standardized intake form. Before November 1st, when this new Sentencing Commission standard was in place, our criteria was more broad, but now our criteria in many instances is more narrow and has to, unfortunately, comport with in many instances, the Sentencing Commission standard, because we're trying to take cases where we can actually move the ball forward. And where we think that there's a likelihood of winning. So our criteria, now in most cases reflects the Sentencing Commission's criteria. We're also looking at things like, who is the judge in the case? What district does this case come from? How long does this person have left on their sentence? There's a lot of things that we look at when we assess a case, and it's pretty, it's pretty unique to each individual circumstance. But there has been an upswell of interest and intake since the closure of FCI Dublin.
Well, I feel like we've covered a lot here. Is there a major thing that we've missed in our discussion?
No, I mean, I think the major thing, just to kind of get back to where we started, is that FCI Dublin's the canary in the coal mine. We have cases from FCI Dublin. We also have cases from FCI Tallahassee. I expect that we'll have cases from other institutions across the country. And so, just as people have been paying attention and believing the stories of the women at FCI Dublin, I hope that people will continue to pay attention and believe the stories of people at FCI Tallahassee, at other women's institutions and other federal corrections institutions, other prisons across the country.
So this really has the potential to open, let's use another analogy, the can of worms.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, in many ways it already has. And I think that that's a good thing. And I hope that, that's our goal with, that's one of the things that we hope to do with these reduction in sentence motions, is to keep getting people released, trying to get people released from custody who have been so horrifically abused by BOP employees. I think that, along with hopefully federal independent oversight, will help create a more fair system and safe system.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Shanna, for coming on and sharing all that. It's horrible and fascinating at the same time.
Yeah, thank you, David. Thanks for having me.
We've been talking with Shanna Rifkin from FAMM. This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next week for more tales from the injustice system.
Thank you to George Powell and Norman Mousequake Barrett for the use of our opening, Everyday Injustice. You can see more of George's music at www.justiceforgeorgepowell.com.